This is a virtual reading of Conspirators, To Each His Own Agenda by Matt Gupta.
Chapter 56. The Healer's Tent. The healers rushed Alistair back to his tent and set about tending to his many wounds. The sword had been removed cleanly, and the healers were attempting to stop the bleeding. Pillimore had taken him to the tent and was holding him down to stop him from fighting against his restraints. The time passed terribly slowly, and it was filled with the prince's screams. Falthor knew better than to intrude, knowing that the healers must focus entirely on Alistair's wounds, so he took to leading the army back into camp. It was cleanly divided between the Islesfield army and the Seaward's force, but regardless of which army they belonged to, the men were broken and defeated. Many of them trailed their shields and spears on the ground, but a great many others simply dropped them on the floor and let them lie forgotten. Baranis and her shield maidens had slightly more discipline and brought their weapons to the tents, but their looks were little better. The day sank into evening, and the evening turned into night. Finally, when the last of the camp torches had been lit, a blood-stained healer finally emerged from Alistair's tent. Pillimore had joined Falthor and Baranis after being rudely evicted from the tent, once the healers had no further use for him. Pillimore threw himself to his feet as soon as he saw the man. He didn't need to make his demands known. The healer nodded to him, exhausted and unwilling to touch anything with his bloodied hands. "His Grace is sleeping." The healer let out a long exhale after he staggered over to him. Falthor summoned him over and poured his water sachet over the healer's bloodied hands. The healer nodded in thanks and wiped the red away with his pale yellow robes. "The sword left a terrible wound, and we must be wary of infection, but he will not die of his wounds or blood loss if the Father be good." Pillimus let out a roar of a laugh. "I told you the little shit was tougher than you thought." Baranis let out a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. Pillimore rounded on her. "I win our bet. You're mine for tonight." "Am I?" Baranis smiled provocatively as she stood up. She pushed him back onto the bench he had been sitting on and mounted him right there, unbuckling her leather skirt. He lifted his kilt so violently he tore it, and he shoved himself in her with equal enthusiasm. "You will find that your cock is mine tonight," she declared defiantly, as if she was leading a war charge. Falthor shook his head disapprovingly, as he had when they had been agreeing the terms of their bet. If Alistair lived, Baranis would be Pillimore's to do with as he pleased throughout the night. If not, then Pillimore would cut off his manhood for Baranis to wear as a trophy. Pillimore's trust in his king would have been inspiring if he hadn't made the same bet over matters far more trivial in the past. He got up laboriously as Baranis and Pillimore went to work. "Is the king able to take company? I would spend this night with less awkward friends." The healer grimaced. Alistair wasn't to be disturbed, but his manhood rose visibly under his robes, and Falthor took that as his answer. The tent stunk of blood and medicine. The healers were cleaning up after themselves. The men showed their disgust at his presence, but they knew him by looks and knew better than to confront him. Falthor took a seat next to Alistair's bed and watched him sleep. His shoulder was bandaged to the point of obscenity, but Falthor was pleased to see that the bandages were white, not red. He waited by Alistair's bed until he fell asleep in his white and blue garments. He had taken off his armor the moment they returned to camp, unlike Baranis, who never took off her armor except to wash, sleep and fornicate. He could hear her and Pillimore for what seemed like hours, unless it was in his dreams. When he woke, he was stiff, and the wooden chair was digging into his back. A healer was attending to Alistair, checking his bandages and applying a poultice to his wounds that smelt of spices. Alistair appeared to have suffered in his sleep, judging by the mess on the floor below them and the blood on the man's hand. It took several days of fever and worry before Alistair awoke. Several more had to pass before he had something of his old self about him. By the end of the week, his wits quickly came back to him, and he was awake for long periods of time, and once the wounds had been tended to, he was able to eat without vomiting blood. Today, it was a bowl of porridge, oats and honey. Falthor took the food from the servant and took to feeding Alistair himself. "Where are Baranis and Pillimore?" Alistair grunted sleepily, in between mouthfuls, "and Bane." "Lady Baranis and Lord Pillimore are setting a debt on a bet. Where Lord Bane and your generals reside, I do not know." Alistair chuckled slightly. "A bet is more valuable to my vassals than standing by my side when I die slowly." The bet was involving her womanhood and his cock. "I think our Scottish king is in love. Again." Alistair raised an eyebrow as best he could. It didn't look any different. Having sampled the contents of Baranis's body, I do not blame Pillimore his neglect. "Shall I call for them?" Falthor offered. Alistair nodded. The last mouthful of the porridge appeared to turn sour in his mouth, and he spat it out. "We have things to discuss." When Falthor made no indication of asking what he meant, he answered anyway. "Our war is not over." The generals came into the tent, even Turgon. His leg had recovered enough for him to sit, but he was being carried around in a litter, something that pleasured him greatly. Pillimore and Baranis came in together. Baranis looked normal, as if nothing had happened, but Pillimore couldn't help stealing glances at her assets. So, Baranis sighed without even addressing Alistair or asking after his health. "When do we break camp?" "We won't," Alistair hissed, as he attempted to sit up. "Ready the army. We take the city before nightfall." Pillimore clapped his hands together with a roar of laughter. "Yes," he bellowed. "My sword will sing again." Baranis and Falthor began to argue, but Falthor's protests won over. "You made an oath before our fathers. You cannot violate that oath." "It is dishonorable," Baranis agreed. "We cannot slaughter those people." "Fuck honor," Turgon spoke for Alistair. "We should have sacked the city a week ago. If we leave now, we lose all credibility. If what we know is true, then the capital's leadership has fallen. Without us, the kingdom will descend into chaos. We started this. We need to finish it. And what of the innocents that will die because of this?" Baranis rounded on him. "We're condemning thousands of people to their deaths." "They have my daughter and my grandchild," Alistair shouted, his wounds opening and staining his bandages in an instant. "This is not up for debate. Assemble the army for attack. Pillimore, you will lead. If any men refuse to fight, hang them." "Do not worry," Pillimore clicked his massive shoulders after summoning in the healers. "No necks will snap this day." "Your priority is my daughter and my grandchild," Alistair ordered, as the healers pushed him down and busied themselves with his wounds. "That has been covered." Falthor laid a hand on his chest soothingly, watching the bandages unravel with distaste on his face. Everyone looked at him curiously. "My men have her at the citadel." "Your men?" "The Kingslayer and his fellow rangers. Decimus's residence was too close to the fighting, and I feared for her safety." "You made a decision on my own daughter, and you didn't consult me." "I was the commander of your army. I commanded. I trust Gilorn and his spy master friend. It is done, and she is safe for it, both her and the babe. Babes are always important, Pillimore nodded. You might want to stay back, he added to Baranis. I suspect I squirted at least 7 sons into your belly. He tried to make a grab for her, but he found he had a knife to his manhood. You had your nights to get into my belly. You will not get another one. She nudged the knife upwards, and a drop of blood dripped onto the tent floor. She leant upwards onto the tips of her toes and kissed him on the cheek. Enough, Alistair choked, a dribble of blood trickling from his mouth. Save your hunger for a time when it's warranted. You have your orders, now execute them. Pillimore and Baranis nodded and left the tent. It was only when they were gone and the blood stopped flowing that Alistair made a move. What the fuck are you doing? Turgon demanded. You need to stay abed. Let the healers help. I will not lie here while my campaign is won for me, Alistair grunted. I will be the one to walk into the citadel and tell my daughter that the city is won. And how do you plan on doing that with your sword arm practically falling off? Falthor was in agreement with Turgon, despite the fact he was trying to help Alistair up. I don't need my arms to walk, Alistair groaned, but fell back into the bed. Get me something for the pain. Inside the city, the morale of the men had been at an all-time high. The Lord Warden was the hero of the realm, and every single man, woman, and child was trying to send him their regards on his combat skill. Most of the men tried to accomplish this by giving the Lord Warden drinks of wine. He did not partake, though, so they drank them themselves. Days of libation had arisen, but the cheers quickly died down when it became apparent that the army wasn't moving on. The city remained on high alert, but very little was being done, and the city had stagnated. Bodies and refuse littered the streets, and rioting and pillaging had broken out in the ruined sections of the city. Several soldiers had broken into a wine cellar and had brought their plunder to share with their officers. It meant that the Lord Warden and Dervan were the only ones in the city who were sober and alert. They had not left the High Temple in the days of peace, due to Dervan's incapacitation, though the merriment had expanded throughout the city. You should have killed him, Dervan stated monotonously, after a long silence between them. Yes, I should have, the Lord Warden agreed, as he had done multiple times before. But I didn't, and that cannot be undone. He will return, and his vengeance will follow him. Maybe I should have let him take the city, Dervan sighed. Yes, you should have, the Lord Warden agreed again. Without proper leadership, the kingdom is doomed. Lord Ignatius has disappeared, his son is in prison, and the people left are either unwilling or too cowardly. Then we should free Lord Decimus right away, unless you fear he will simply give the city to Alistair once he takes his place as the new dictator. No, Dervan shook his head without hesitation. He's too ambitious for that. He won't let Alistair through those gates unless he sees he can gain something for it. He is still Alistair's creature, though. New leadership is required. The question is, what takes Ignatius's place? An elected king? A useless fat man? A council of old corrupt men? A group of inexperienced zealots? That is the problem, Dervan agreed. How long do you think we have? It doesn't matter. When their minds clear, the people will look to you for leadership. You must give it, or we will fall. Why me? Because they say so. It wasn't a suggestion, and Dervan knew it. Captain! A Citadel lieutenant came rushing over to them, swaying slightly with the drink. Alistair's force hasn't moved on. Why would he? Dervan rolled his eyes. His army won't move until he can scratch his own arse himself. They're marshalling outside the city. The lieutenant was panting hard, as if he had run a race. Attack formations. How much have you had to drink? No, he's right. The Lord Warden was watching the water in his glass goblet. The water was rhythmically thumping, causing rings to form in the liquid. How many? Dervin questioned, attempting to stand. The entire army, by the looks of it. The Lord Warden's eyes narrowed. He placed a hand on Dervin's shoulder as he stood up. What are your orders? Surrender, Dervin offered. They're not here to take a surrender. The Lord Warden shook his head. They gave us that chance and we spat it back at them. They are here to destroy us. Recall our forces, sober or drunk. Better to die with a sword in hand. Alistair's army flooded into the city. Pillimore had been right. Honor wasn't an obstacle to the army, and none needed the threat of hanging to spur them on. Before even half the army made it past the wall, the outer city was lost. The whole city was suddenly alive with screams, clashing swords, and the sounds of steel breaking flesh. Pillimore was leading the invasion, his huge two-handed sword dripping red with blood and gore. Baranis was leading her forces to cover the southern part of the city. Though she had no intentions of pillage and destruction, her forces had other ideas. But before she could do anything about it, she was quickly fighting for her life, and such concerns vanished. The Lord Warden watched from the top of the stairs to the High Temple. The wardens who had stayed with him were standing next to him, their expressions blank against the destruction of the city. Dervin sent his lieutenant out to help, though all he successfully did was vomit in a corner. There are 4 wardens at the citadel, the Lord Warden instructed to him. Go now. What will you do? The man asked, raising his helmet to wipe his mouth. What we stayed for. He donned his helmet, and a warden brought him his shield and a spear. The wardens stood their vigil at the top of the stairs, waiting for the other 4 to arrive. When they did, they simply stood and watched the army to reach the stairs. The attack was in full swing by the time that Alistair had mounted, or rather been tied to, his horse, and his knights, along with Felthor and his bodyguards, had entered the city. The ram had been pulled apart, and now the gate was open. Their pace was slow, and Alistair often needed to stop and be propped back up. Fortunately, he didn't fall. At his insistence, they visited Decimus's residence. Falthor had been right to send Gilorn to move Callisto. The entire building had been scorched, and part of the building had been torn away by a boulder. There was a woman lying dead in the doorway, and a man was lying on top of her with a knife in his back. He was a ranger. Alistair spurred his horse on, and they began the long journey to the citadel. Avoiding the fighting was impossible, but the sight of the 2 army generals caused their troops to protect them from the worst of the fighting. Gilorn and his rangers had been waiting in the citadel for nearly a week. None of them had gotten much sleep. Rufus hadn't given them much respite, and the acoustics in the throne room did nothing to help with the sounds of his crying. Callisto was irritable without the aid of her servants, but her handmaiden had taken over much of the care for the child. The rangers had gone to the storeroom with the citadel guardsmen to get food and blankets, but none of them had left the citadel since their arrival. It was only when the sounds of war started that they woke up from the stupor and rearmed themselves. The citadel guards raised their spears into a hoplite stance, but then the doors began to creak open. The rangers knocked and drew. A procession of knights entered the throne room. There was no light, so when the door fully opened they were blinded and couldn't see the men entering. They crossed halfway into the room before they could make out the details. "Father," Callisto called, waking Rufus up from the small moment of silence he had allowed them. Alistair smiled. He wasn't wearing his helmet, and crossed the rest of the room in a daze. He embraced her painfully and clumsily, requiring a knight to rush to his aid, thinking he would fall. Callisto's face fell when she saw how wounded he was, but he straightened up and gently held her. "The city is taken," he told her. "We have won." She sighed in relief, but then her concern took her. "Fetch the healers," she commanded to his knights. "Sit, father," she gestured to the rangers to help him to the side throne. "I shall," Alistair grumbled, looking up at Yorlim, who was still in the process of waking up. He was using the coin-studded cloak as a blanket. "Shit," Yorlim cursed, and he quickly tried to throw the cloak off of him, but he fumbled the silver fastenings and simply got caught in it. He fell off the throne and struggled to Alistair's feet. "I think it's time the reign of the stewards came to an end," Felthor chuckled, and all the knights present laughed. Gaelorn chuckled as well, and he took the cloak from Yorlim. He presented it to Alistair. "The citadel is yours, my lord." Alistair ignored him, his eyes on the throne. Yorlim crawled to his feet and retreated, apologizing for his actions, but all Alistair could do was climb the stairs to the throne. It was a slow climb, but he refused help. He let out a huge sigh of relief as he sunk into the throne and straightened up. "Hail, Alistair, King!" Felthor shouted, making all of them jump. His voice echoed around the room, and it was only when the echoes subsided that they all knelt down to one knee. Alistair smiled as he looked down at his subjects bowing before him. His moment was interrupted, however, when a blood-stained knight of Islesfield came rushing into the room. "General Felthor," he shouted, and he fell before them. "The High Temple is holding up against us. The Lord Warden and his soldiers have beaten back our assault. General Pilimor's forces are clashing with them now. We need help." Felthor looked to Alistair. "Go," Alistair groaned, blood starting to dribble from his mouth. "Take the Kingslayer with you." Felthor nodded as he straightened up. Yorlim made to go with them. "You stay." Alistair pointed a stern and shaking hand to Yorlim. "I would have words,"